We've talked about different types of parts, protectors and exiles. And we've also talked about the self, the central part of us that does the observing, and it is the natural leader. And we've talked about how, even though the self is designed to be the leader, and has the wisdom and compassion and strength to be the leader, its leadership is often subverted by various parts. Parts can overwhelm the self and take control. I find this kind of surprising, but experientially very true. It seems that self, like any other leader, must maintain the trust of those it leads in order to avoid a mutiny. During times of neglect or stress or trauma, a child is often not able to navigate the situation in a satisfactory fashion, and parts become terrified or deeply shamed. When this happens, other parts believe that extreme measures need to be taken, so they rise up and vie for control. They can be compared to what psychologists call parentified children. When parents are compromised or absent, one or more of the older children are forced to take the responsibility of parenting. Often there's a role reversal, where the child ends up caring for the poorly functioning parent. The problem is that the child isn't equipped with the knowledge and maturity and skills to be the parent. He's pressed into a role that he's not equipped for and often doesn't desire. Yet he believes that the family's very survival depends upon him fulfilling that role. A similar parentification can happen in the internal family. When a child faces neglect or trauma, younger and ill-equipped parts of the heart come to believe that the person's very survival entirely depends upon them. So they adopt what they think is the best strategy. Perhaps they're hypervigilant, or advocate withdrawal, or becoming controlling, or obsessive. These ill-equipped parts can shove aside our self and even dominate our lives, particularly when something happens to make us afraid. So a primary goal of Renew Ministry is to help the self, as it is led by the Holy Spirit, to regain the trust of the parts in order to reestablish the self as the compassionate and courageous leader of the heart. We do this by fostering healing relationships in the inner world in 3 ways. We work to mend relationships between different parts that are in conflict. Secondly, we work to mend relationships between our parts and ourself. And thirdly, we work to mend relationships between every part of ourselves and the Lord. Now we know that whenever we receive healing truth, it ultimately comes from God, who is truth. But often that truth flows most naturally through the self. So our primary relationship goal is to establish and strengthen the relationship between ourself and our parts. When that happens, the other 2 relationship goals are more easily met. When the self is better trusted by the parts, it is better able to manage the conflict that exists between parts. Also, when we strengthen the relationship between the self and the parts, the self is better able to introduce the parts to the Lord and to the broader gospel. In our experience, we found that self can be a very powerful healing agent for hurting parts. This is particularly true when self is trusting the Lord and led by the Spirit of the Lord. Probably the most important process for building relationships between the parts and the self is the process of blending and unblending. Blending is good. In fact, the heart is designed for the self to blend with our parts. As we attempt to meet the challenges and opportunities of life, self calls upon various parts with various strengths. So, as we look below the waterline and seek to understand and strengthen relationships with our parts, blending is an important tool. It's the way we come to better understand the part, feel its emotions, listens to its story, understand its burdens, and point it to God and to healing. Now, when we fully blend with a part, we feel its feelings, we think its thoughts, and we believe its perspectives. it feels like we are the part. And fully blending can be helpful to get to know a part or to hear its story. However, when fully blended, our sense of self is diminished or lost. And without any sense of self, it's impossible for the part to get to know the self or the self to get to know the part. So our goal is to blend with the target part, but not to fully blend whenever possible. In a later section, I'll give you some common questions that we ask in the ministry. Some of the questions help us to find the part and blend with it, and some help us to unblend from the part. Probably our most important question is an unblending question. It's, how do you feel toward the part? Now, in order to have a feeling toward a part, you have to be unblended enough to be aware of it so that you can have a feeling toward it. So this is the good question to help us unblend. And if there's sufficient unblending, then we can use some other questions to improve the relationship between the self and the parts. Following IFS terminology, we call this insight. Insight is when the recipient looks within, finds a part, and with genuine curiosity or compassion, seeks to develop a relationship with it in order to understand it, discover its concerns, and negotiate a way forward. But very often, parts will refuse to unblend, and the recipient will be unable to find any genuine curiosity or compassion. Often the recipient will be blended with a manager that is in conflict with the part that you're trying to get to know. And when you ask them how they feel toward it, they say, "I hate it. It's always getting me into trouble," or some such statement. Later we'll learn how to work with such polarized managers to get them to step back and unblend. So we find that even with our best efforts, one part or another frequently refuses to unblend. When that happens, the spirit-led self of the caregiver becomes the primary healing agent. The caregiver asks if he can speak to the part, and the caregiver then functions as the curious, compassionate, courageous leader until the recipient can find a greater sense of self. We call this direct access. Direct access is when the caregiver, with genuine curiosity, compassion, and courage, interacts with the part of the recipient to understand it, discover its concerns, and negotiate a way forward. So in summary, Renew Ministry is all about relationship. Our goal is to rebuild inner relationships between parts that are in conflict, to foster relationship between parts and the self, and to build relationship between all of the recipient and the Lord. The primary way we do this is by blending or connecting with inner parts, getting to know them, and bringing God's perspective, correction, or comfort as needed. This concludes Module 4 on the foundational concepts of Renew Soul Care Ministry. We talked about the work of the Holy Spirit in healing the soul. We talked about the multiplicity of the heart, about the various roles that parts assume, about the existence and healing power of the self. And lastly, we talked about building relationships through blending and unblending. In the next module, we'll look at how to work with parts and find healing for the heart.